Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get into this one.
Yeah, me too. So today we are doing a deep dive into a topic that, honestly, it kind of messes with your head a little bit once you start seeing the data.
Oh, absolutely. It completely flips how you look at success.
Right, because, okay, I want you, the listener, to just imagine the smartest person you know, like raw intelligence.
The person who just aces every test without studying.
Exactly. Or, maybe they're running a Fortune 500 company and making millions. Or, on the flip side, maybe they're this brilliant polymath who understands, like, quantum physics, but they're totally broke, right?
And struggling to navigate basic corporate ladders or just pay rent.
Totally. We are so conditioned to view raw intelligence as this ultimate individual trump card, like a personal superpower.
Right, a private asset.
But the data reveals this incredibly jarring paradox. Knowing a person's individual test score or their IQ is actually a remarkably weak predictor of their lifetime income or their financial stability.
Surprisingly weak, yeah.
However, and this is the hook, if you take that exact same metric and you zoom out, if you look at a nation's average cognitive skill,
The collective average, right?
right, the collective, it becomes this overwhelmingly powerful predictor of that country's wealth, the reliability of its power grid, the stability of its government, everything.
It's night and day.
So today we are using the book Hive Mind, How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much by Garett Jones as our sort of analytical entry point, because entire societies spend decades searching for resources or historical policies or, charismatic leaders to explain why some places thrive and others just collapse.
And they miss the invisible layer.
Exactly. What if the deeper driver of national success is something far less visible? What if it's the collective cognitive environment you live inside?
I love that framing because to really grasp the magnitude of that paradox, we have to fundamentally discard the way we usually talk about intelligence.
Right, because usually it's just about who got into Harvard.
Exactly, yeah. The cultural conversation almost always frames cognitive ability as a matter of individual academic merit. A private trophy that dictates who gets a prestigious job or a higher salary.
Which makes sense on a personal level.
It does, but that framework is completely useless for this systems-level analysis.
Okay, so how should we be looking at it?
What we are examining today is how cognitive capacity functions as invisible, shared institutional infrastructure.
Institutional infrastructure, okay.
Yeah, think about how a nation relies on a physical highway system, right, to transport goods, or, say, a fiber optic network to route data.
Sure, physical things you can see and measure.
Right. Well, in the exact same way, a society relies on the collective, abstract, problem-solving capacity of its population to make complex, modern systems function.
Because modern systems are basically just millions of people interacting.
Exactly. When millions of strangers interact through, contracts, supply chains, democratic elections, the average cognitive environment dictates whether those systems operate smoothly or if they just completely break down.
The implication there is that intelligence isn't just a tool you use, it's an environment you inhabit.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Yes.
But, okay, before we theorize too much about the mechanisms of this shared infrastructure, I think we have to ground this in the actual economic data.
Definitely. We need the numbers.
Because the gap in national outcomes based on this metric, it's not some subtle statistical variance, right?
It is massive.
Right. When you look at the global data comparing average test scores to national wealth, the nations in the bottom 10% worldwide are roughly 1/8 as rich and productive as nations in the top 10%.
1/8. Think about that.
That's staggering. We aren't talking about a slight dip in GDP. 1/8 means the difference between a society where clean water and automated banking are just afterthoughts.
You don't even think about them.
Exactly. Versus a society where basic subsistence is a daily struggle and the power grid goes down for 12 hours a day.
And that exponential wealth gap at the national level, it becomes even more perplexing when you contrast it with the individual data. Well, if intelligence is the ultimate economic driver, like we're usually taught, you would expect the absolute smartest individuals within any given country to be hoarding all the wealth.
Right. You'd expect a perfect linear correlation. Smartest guy gets the most money.
But a landmark 2001 meta-analysis by economists Samuel Bowles, Herbert Gintis, and Melissa Osborne definitively shattered that assumption.
Okay, what did they find?
They aggregated dozens of studies tracking the relationship between individual IQ scores and individual wages. And the finding was that the individual IQ premium.
For premium being like the actual cash value of being smarter.
Right, the literal percentage increase in your salary directly attributable to scoring higher on a cognitive test than the person sitting right next to you.
Okay.
It's actually quite modest. It accounts for a fraction of the variance in personal wealth.
I really want to linger on that for a second because it completely contradicts a very popular narrative.
It really does.
We are constantly told we live in this hyper-competitive, post-industrial information age. The conventional wisdom is, 50 years ago, you could make a great living with strong shoulders and a high school diploma.
The factory town era.
Right. But today, the story goes, raw brain power is the only currency the market actually cares about.
But the Bowles, Gintis, and Osborne data shows that narrative is largely a myth.
Wait, really? A myth?
Yeah, the labor market values individual IQ today about the same as it did in the 1960s.
That is wild. So it's not just raw intelligence. What is driving individual wealth?
Other factors, things like conscientiousness, your parents' wealth, your geographic location, and honestly, just sheer luck.
Luck is always the unacknowledged variable.
Exactly. They play massive roles in individual pie slicing. You might use your higher cognitive processing to negotiate a slightly better starting salary, sure.
Or figure out how to navigate a corporate promotion.
Right. But it does not decouple you from the economic reality of your surroundings.
But then, when we zoom out again to the national level,
when we aggregate those scores to the national average, the correlation with prosperity becomes undeniable.
So the high-scoring nations, places like Singapore, Finland, post-Mao China,
They exhibit very specific structural traits. They possess functional, paved roads, incredibly low rates of bureaucratic corruption, and massive pools of private investment.
and low-scoring nations.
They are universally plagued by fragile infrastructure, sluggish bureaucracies where simple permits take years, and they have a really hard time attracting international capital.
Okay, I am trying to reconcile these two realities. Because I'm thinking of a brilliant friend of mine. He's a software engineer.
Yeah.
Let's say he has an IQ in the 99th percentile. Absolute genius. If he lives in an environment with a low average cognitive baseline, his personal brilliance doesn't just magically generate $1 billion.
No, it doesn't. He's trapped.
Exactly. He can write the most elegant code in the world, but if the local power grid shuts off his servers at random...
Or the local banking system can't process his international payments.
Right. Or the courts won't protect his intellectual property. His individual genius is just economically inert.
It's like having a Ferrari in a city with no paved roads.
That's a perfect analogy. Or, it feels similar to a structural ceiling in professional sports.
No, how so?
Well, think about it. If you are an objectively mediocre player on a championship-winning team,
You still get the ring.
you get the ring, your endorsement deals, your salary, your whole career trajectory is going to be astronomically higher than if you are the absolute star player on a team that finishes dead last every single season.
Yes, the environment dictates the ceiling of the individual.
Your environment dictates your ceiling.
Wow. And what's fascinating here is that mechanism, the environment dictating the ceiling, is the exact difference between pie slicing and pie growing.
Okay, break that down for me. Pie slicing versus pie growing.
When you fight for a salary bump based on your individual intelligence, you are haggling over the size of your slice in a fixed pie.
You're just taking a slightly bigger piece from someone else.
Exactly. But collective intelligence grows the pie itself. The hive mind is an emergent property.
Meaning it's bigger than the sum of its parts.
Right. It is the result of millions of micro-interactions that happen every single day.
Like what? Give me an example.
It's the municipal accountant spotting a structural deficit before the city actually goes bankrupt.
Oh, okay.
Or it's the warehouse manager organizing a supply chain so efficiently that shipping costs drop by 2% across the board.
Or even just like the average voter taking 45 minutes to actually read the implications of a local bond measure.
Yes, rather than just voting based on the color of a yard sign.
Right, right.
Millions of these competent, abstract reasoning behaviors act as a modern iteration of Adam Smith's invisible hand.
They construct this highly reliable, low-friction society.
And you, as a resident of that society, reap the massive economic dividends of that reliability.
Regardless of whether your personal test score is a 90 or a 140. Okay, but if we are going to hinge national wealth on collective cognitive capacity, I feel like we immediately run into a methodological minefield here.
Oh, the measurement problem, yeah.
Right. How do economists actually measure something as nebulous as intelligence across the entire globe without essentially just measuring which country has richer, more culturally dominant schools.
That's the first critique everyone has.
Because if a test asks a child in rural Indonesia to identify a snowplow, it isn't measuring cognitive capacity, it's just measuring geographic exposure.
Right, and the problem with cultural bias is the very first thing psychometricians and economists have to solve. Because if the data relies on cultural trivia, the entire premise just collapses.
So how do they solve it?
Well, to build these global data sets, researchers do not use a single localized test. They synthesize massive international assessments.
Like which ones?
You have PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment.
Yeah.
You have TIMSS, measuring math and science trends.
Yeah.
And PRLS, which tracks reading literacy.
Okay, so these are standardized tests taken by millions of students globally.
Yes, but more importantly, economists rely heavily on nonverbal cognitive tests, the most prominent one being Raven's progressive matrices.
I am actually familiar with the Raven's test. It basically looks like a visual puzzle.
Exactly.
You are given a grid of geometric shapes with one piece missing, and you have to identify the underlying logical rule governing the shapes. Maybe they, I don't know, rotate 90 degrees and change color to pick the correct missing piece.
And what's key there is that there are no words.
Right. You don't need to speak English or Mandarin, and you don't need to know historical dates.
That visual nonverbal design is deliberate because it targets a very specific mechanism. Fluid reasoning.
Fluid reasoning. Okay, what exactly is that?
Fluid reasoning is the ability to hold multiple novel variables in your working memory and manipulate them to recognize abstract patterns.
Okay, that sounds a bit academic. Can you give me a concrete example?
Sure, the philosopher James Flynn illustrated this beautifully with a seemingly simple question. He'd ask, what do dogs and rabbits have in common?
Dogs and rabbits. Okay.
Now, if a person relies purely on concrete, physical observation, they might say, well, you use dogs to hunt rabbits.
Which is true, but it's a functional, localized observation.
Exactly. But fluid reasoning allows a person to detach from that immediate physical utility and pull those two entities into an abstract category.
Oh, I see. So they recognize that both are mammals, both are warm-blooded, both are living organisms.
Right. That capacity for abstraction is exactly what the Raven's matrices test is measuring with the shapes.
Okay, I can see how abstract categorization helps you score well on a visual puzzle. But how does that jump from geometric shapes to a nation's math or reading scores?
That's that question.
Because if a country is good at visual puzzles, does that automatically mean they are good at algebra?
Yes, actually, through a mechanism known as the Da Vinci effect, or what psychometricians call the G factor.
The G factor being general intelligence.
Exactly. At the individual level, doing well on a test of spatial reasoning strongly predicts that you will also do well on a test of reading comprehension, or advanced calculus.
Because it's all using the same underlying engine.
Right. The cognitive hardware required to hold complex visual patterns in your head is the exact same hardware required to hold complex narrative structures or mathematical equations in your head.
Okay, that makes sense for an individual, but across a whole country.
That was a big breakthrough for researchers like Heiner Rinderman. He proved that this Da Vinci effect scales across borders.
Oh, wow. So the whole nation acts like the individual.
When they aggregate the data, yes. A nation that scores highly on the nonverbal Raven's test almost invariably scores highly on PISA math and PRLS reading. These metrics move together,
Creating this highly robust, unified index of a nation's cognitive baseline.
Precisely.
Now, that unified index brings up a really critical caveat that we need to make explicitly clear for the listener.
Yes, please do.
When we talk about a nation's cognitive baseline, it is very easy for this conversation to veer into genetic determinism, like biological destiny.
Which is completely wrong.
Right. My reading of the source material is that these global test scores are not tracking inherent, unchangeable biological traits. They are largely tracking environmental infrastructure.
That is a vital distinction. The data is entirely clear that a nation's cognitive capacity is heavily endogenous,
Endogenous meaning generated from within the system.
meaning it is shaped from within by the environment the society physically builds.
Okay, how does that work physically?
Fluid reasoning happens in the physical tissue of the brain, right? So if a child grows up in an environment with severe iodine deficiency,
Which is still a huge problem in many parts of the world.
it is. Or if they are constantly expending metabolic energy fighting off endemic parasites and infectious diseases, the physical development of the prefrontal cortex is literally compromised.
Because the body is prioritizing survival over brain development.
Exactly. Furthermore, modern schooling, even if it isn't specifically teaching to the Raven's test, forces the brain to practice abstract categorization daily.
So it's basically taking the brain to the gym.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm.
When you measure a nation's average cognitive score, you are not taking a genetic fingerprint. You are taking a thermometer reading of their public health, their childhood nutrition, and their educational ecosystem.
You are measuring the physical brain capital that a society has managed to construct.
Beautifully put, yes.
That sets up a really fascinating chain of causality. Public health and education build the physical capacity for fluid reasoning, and then fluid reasoning allows individuals to hold multiple abstract variables in their minds.
Right.
But what happens when you put two people with that high capacity into a room together and force them to negotiate?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is where the abstract geometry of shapes turns into the physical architecture of an economy. Let's walk through the Vanderbilt University experiments detailed in the book because they perfectly illustrate how cognitive capacity changes the very nature of human interaction.
The Vanderbilt experiments are brilliant because they isolate the exact difference between pie slicing and pie growing in real time.
Okay, set the scene for us.
The researchers brought in business students and gave them a cognitive assessment, specifically the GMAT, which heavily correlates with fluid reasoning and general intelligence.
Okay.
Then they paired the students up to negotiate.
So, study one, what was the setup?
Study one was designed as a zero-sum commodity exchange. One student was selling a shipment of tin, and the other was buying.
Tin, just a basic commodity.
Right, and the parameters were rigid. The seller wanted the highest possible price, and the buyer wanted the lowest possible price.
So every dollar the buyer saved was a literal dollar the seller lost. It's a pure tug of war. And honestly, in a scenario like that, you would assume the person with the higher cognitive processing power would outmaneuver the other person.
That's what you think.
Yeah, you'd think they would calculate the leverage points and just crush their opponent to extract maximum value.
That is exactly what the researchers assumed. But the data proved them completely wrong.
Wait, really? The smart kids didn't win.
In that rigid single-variable negotiation, cognitive test scores provided almost zero advantage.
Wow.
The high-scoring students were not materially better at buying low or selling high. When the pie is fixed, raw intelligence doesn't make you a significantly better pie slicer.
That is wild. But then there was study two.
Right. Study 2 changed the entire geometry of the interaction. They removed the single variable of price and introduced what management professors call an integrative bargaining scenario.
The mall developer scenario. This is where the mechanisms of working memory really shine.
Tell them how it works.
Okay, so in this simulation, one student plays the developer of a new shopping mall, and the other plays the representative of a massive potential anchor store.
Like a big department store.
Exactly. And they aren't just haggling over the monthly rent anymore. They are suddenly dealing with a whole matrix of interdependent variables.
It gets complicated fast.
Right. The store wants the right to sublease part of its floor space to a luxury cosmetics brand. The developer wants the store to pay for the maintenance of the central escalators. They have to agree on operating hours, exterior signage rights, liability insurance.
This is where fluid reasoning becomes an absolute economic superpower.
Because there are so many moving parts.
Yes. To succeed in study 2, you cannot just pull on a single rope. You have to hold 4 or 5 moving variables in your working memory simultaneously.
You have to realize, oh, if I concede the escalator maintenance cost, which saves them $50,000, I can demand the right to control the exterior signage, which generates $70,000 in advertising revenue for me.
Exactly. And the researchers found that pairs of negotiators with higher average cognitive scores were dramatically more successful at finding these complex, integrative solutions.
They mapped out the variables and found the, what is it called, the Pareto optimal frontier.
Yes, what we colloquially call win-win scenarios. They actively grew the pie.
That's amazing.
And what is particularly striking is that the researchers also tested for personality traits.
Oh, like extroversion or stuff?
Yeah. They looked at extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness.
Yeah.
None of those personality metrics predicted the ability to find win-win solutions nearly as well as the raw cognitive test scores.
See, that completely challenges my assumption that finding a win-win compromise is just about being a nice person.
It's not.
The Vanderbilt study suggests it isn't about niceness at all. It's about processing power. You have to literally possess the cognitive RAM to see the geometry of the deal.
Exactly. If your working memory drops the variable about the escalator, the win-win solution vanishes,
Yeah.
and you just revert back to a zero-sum tug-of-war over rent.
And this dynamic scales up incredibly well when we look at game theory, specifically the repeated prisoner's dilemma. Can you explain the mechanics of that game and why cognitive skill alters the outcome so drastically?
Sure. The repeated prisoner's dilemma is basically the foundational model for understanding how trust operates in a society.
Okay, give us a setup.
Imagine you and a partner are arrested, placed in separate interrogation rooms, and offered a deal.
The classic police interrogation tactic.
Right. If you both stay silent, if you cooperate with each other, you both get a minor one-year sentence.
Which is the best mutual outcome.
Yes. But if you betray your partner and testify, and your partner stays silent, you go free while your partner gets 10 years.
Ouch.
And if you both betray each other, you both get 5 years.
Okay, so in a one-off scenario, if I'm just playing this once, the strictly rational, self-interested mathematical move is always to betray, because I either go free or I avoid the 10-year sentence.
Exactly. In a one-shot game, math says betray.
But the real world isn't a one-off game. We interact with the same suppliers, the same coworkers, and the same neighbors day after day, year after year.
And when the game is repeated indefinitely, the math changes. Because if I betray you today to get a quick win, you are going to betray me tomorrow and the next day, and we both end up serving 5-year sentences forever.
Right. We just destroy each other.
So when researchers run this repeated game and track the cognitive scores of the participants, a really distinct pattern emerges among higher-scoring groups.
What do they do differently?
They exhibit 3 highly specific behavioral traits. They are more pleasant, more perceptive, and more forgiving.
Okay, let's break those down. How are they more pleasant?
They are pleasant because they usually open the game by cooperating. They signal their willingness to build trust right from round 1.
And perceptive.
They are perceptive because they use their fluid reasoning to map out the long-term consequences of betrayal. They recognize that $1 stolen today costs them $100 in lost cooperation over the next year.
Okay. And the forgiving part.
Crucially, they are forgiving. If the other player makes a mistake or briefly defects, the higher-scoring players are willing to return to cooperation rather than engaging in a mutually destructive blood feud.
That forgiveness aspect is fascinating because it isn't born out of altruism or morality. It's born out of long-term optimization.
It's just good business.
Right. But I want to push back on this idea that high-scoring individuals are uniformly pleasant cooperators. It paints a slightly utopian picture because we know that intelligent people can be incredibly ruthless in protecting their systems. And the book details a public goods game conducted at Brown University with Ivy League students that adds a very sharp edge to this concept of cooperation.
Yes, the Brown University study provides some very necessary nuance here. It proves that high cognitive capacity leads to strategic cooperation, not naive martyrdom.
Okay, how did that game work?
In a public goods game, a group of players is given a set amount of money. Each round, they can secretly choose how much to keep for themselves and how much to donate to a central communal pot. The communal pot is then multiplied by the researchers. Let's say it's doubled, and then distributed equally among everyone, regardless of who actually contributed.
So if everyone donates everything, everyone doubles their money. It's an optimal scenario.
Yes. But the temptation is to be a free rider. You keep your own money, let everyone else donate, and then collect your equal share of their multiplied funds.
So you win big time while they take the risks.
Exactly.
And what did the Ivy League students do? Did their high test scores make them more generous?
Initially, yes. The students with the highest cognitive scores put significantly more money into the communal pot early in the game.
So they were doing the pleasant thing, trying to establish a high-trust equilibrium.
Right. But the researchers added a twist. They allowed the players to vote on a rule that would financially penalize anyone who was caught free riding.
Oh, wow. And what happened?
The students with the highest cognitive scores were the most aggressive advocates for implementing strict punishments.
Really? They wanted the harsh rules.
They were more than willing to spend their own money just to enforce penalties on the free riders.
Why?
Because they understood that a high-trust, high-yield system is inherently fragile. If you don't aggressively punish the parasites, the cooperators will eventually stop donating, the central pot dries up, and everyone loses.
Wow. So their intelligence allowed them to build the cooperative system, and it also compelled them to ruthlessly defend it.
Exactly. They were pleasant to the cooperators, but absolutely lethal to the defectors.
That requires an incredible ability to read the room, to anticipate how other people are going to behave before they even make a move.
It does. The book describes this as intelligence acting as a form of deep social perception.
And the ultimate test of this social perception is the Keynesian beauty contest. I really want to walk through the math of this game because it completely blew my mind when I read it.
It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, it isn't a beauty contest in the physical sense.
Right, right. It's a numbers game invented by the economist John Maynard Keynes to explain stock market behavior.
It is a brilliant illustration of infinite regress in human logic.
Okay, let's go over the rules.
You have a group of 100 people. Everyone must secretly pick a number between 0 and 100.
Okay.
The winner of the game is the person whose guess is closest to exactly 1/2 of the average of everyone else's guesses.
Okay, let me map out the logic of a player in this game. So level 0 logic is just picking a random number, say 70.
Right, no real thought put into it.
But if I stop and think, well, what if everyone just guesses randomly? The average of random guesses between 0 and 100 will be 50. Half of 50 is 25. So level 1 logic dictates I should guess 25.
Spot on.
But wait, what if everyone else in the room is also smart enough to use level 1 logic?
Now you're getting it.
If everyone guesses 25, the average is 25. Half of 25 is 12.5. So level 2 logic means I should guess 12.5.
And you can keep running that algorithm indefinitely. If everyone is perfectly rational and everyone assumed everyone else is perfectly rational, the guesses will continuously have themselves.
From 25 to 12.5 to 6.25.
All the way down to the only mathematically stable equilibrium, which is 0. If you are a perfectly rational game theorist, you guess 0.
But, and this is the kicker, if I guess 0 in the real world, I will almost certainly lose the game.
Why is that?
Because human beings are not perfectly rational game theorists. Someone in the room is going to randomly guess 80, which pulls the average up.
Yes. So the Keynesian beauty contest isn't actually a test of pure math.
It is a test of your ability to accurately estimate the cognitive depth of the specific strangers you are playing against.
You have to ask yourself, are the people in this room mostly level 1 thinkers or level 2 thinkers?
Exactly. It tests your social perception. And when researchers run this game, individuals with higher cognitive test scores are significantly better at anticipating the behavior of the group.
They guess closer to the actual winning number, because their fluid reasoning allows them to vividly model the minds of the people around them.
Which completely shatters the stereotype of the hyper-intelligent person as an isolated, socially inept savant.
Completely. In complex economic environments, cognitive capacity translates directly into social perception. It allows you to anticipate the moves of your competitors, your suppliers, and your customers.
So when you combine all of these experiments, the mall developer, the public goods game, the Keynesian beauty contest, a unified picture emerges. High cognitive capacity allows individuals to see what economists call the shadow of the future.
The shadow of the future, I love that phrase.
Because they can process abstract variables, they can vividly imagine the long-term compounding benefits of a functional relationship. They recognize that burning a bridge today to steal a few dollars costs them 10 bridges tomorrow.
Cooperation isn't a moral imperative for them. It is a mathematically optimized strategy.
Right. But here is where we make the leap from microeconomics to macroeconomics. We've established that the shadow of the future makes two people in a room more cooperative. What happens when an entire nation of millions of people is simultaneously looking to the future?
How does that alter the physical reality of a country? It fundamentally rewrites the nation's capital structure. And the mechanism for this was best articulated by the mathematician Frank Ramsey in the 1920s.
Okay, Frank Ramsey, what did he figure out?
He developed a calculus of variations to model national economic growth, and he arrived at a principle known as the mathematical theory of saving.
And what's the core insight there?
The core insight is that capital accumulation, the literal building of factories, power grids, and research labs, is entirely dependent on a psychological trait: patience.
Patience. I need you to unpack that mechanism. How does individual patience translate into a physical power grid?
It comes down to delayed gratification and resource allocation.
Okay.
Imagine a society produces a certain amount of economic value each year. If the population is highly impatient, If they heavily discount the future, they will consume all of that value immediately.
They will buy larger houses, import luxury goods, consume lavish meals.
Right. Because they are consuming all their resources today, there is absolutely nothing left over to invest.
Makes sense.
But if a population exhibits high patience, they voluntarily delay their consumption. Instead of buying a new car, a citizen puts a portion of their income into a bank, or a retirement fund, or a corporate bond.
And that saved money does not just sit in a vault.
Exactly. The financial system routes that saved capital to an entrepreneur who uses it to buy heavy machinery, lay fiber optic cables, or fund a decade of pharmaceutical research.
So individual patience aggregates into the physical capital that makes the entire nation vastly more productive in the next decade.
Ramsey proved that savings literally equals investment.
It's essentially a geopolitical manifestation of the famous Stanford marshmallow experiment.
Oh, the kids with the marshmallows, yes.
Right. In that study, researchers offered a child one marshmallow immediately, or two marshmallows if they could sit alone in a room and wait for 15 minutes.
It's a test of impulse control.
Exactly. So we are looking at a nation-sized marshmallow test. A society with a low average cognitive baseline struggles to see the shadow of the future, so they eat the single marshmallow immediately. They consume their resources.
But a society with a high average cognitive baseline uses its fluid reasoning to vividly model the future.
They don't just wait for two marshmallows. They take their current marshmallow, melt it down, and use it to build a marshmallow-producing factory that will yield 10,000 marshmallows over the next 20 years.
That is precisely what the global data reflects. The book features a really compelling chart, figure 4.1, which maps a nation's average test scores against its national savings rate.
And what does it show?
The correlation is stark and intensely positive. As national cognitive scores rise, the percentage of GDP that the nation saves and invests absolutely skyrockets.
Wow.
And this patience leads to an economic phenomenon known as the Feldstein-Horioka puzzle.
Okay, what is that puzzle?
Well, for decades, classical economists assumed that capital would flow fluidly across borders to wherever labor was cheapest.
Right. If you have $1 million to invest, you should build your factory in a country where wages are incredibly low to maximize your profit margin. Why build a factory in high-wage Switzerland when you can build it in a developing nation for a fraction of the cost?
That was the theory. But economists Martin Feldstein and Charles Horioka looked at the data and found that this theoretical flow of capital simply wasn't happening to the degree models predicted.
Capital is staying home.
Stubbornly staying home. High savings nations were largely investing in their own domestic economies despite the higher labor costs.
Why?
But as the global economy has become more financialized, we see a new layer to this puzzle. High-scoring, patient nations aren't just building domestic factories anymore. They're actively acquiring massive foreign wealth.
Because their populations generate huge surpluses of savings.
Yes, their financial institutions deploy that capital globally. They are buying foreign equities, sovereign debt, real estate.
So the high cognitive environments are systematically hoarding the future wealth of the world because their populations possess the systemic patience to delay gratification.
Exactly.
But wait, is that just because every single citizen in Singapore or Finland is a mathematical genius optimizing their personal spreadsheet? That seems highly unlikely. Even in high-scoring nations, most people aren't sitting around doing calculus to plan their retirement.
You are absolutely right, and this is where the true power of the hive mind emerges. It isn't about individual calculus at all. It is about sociological conformity.
Conformity, like peer pressure.
Exactly. The economist Brian Kaplan points out that humans are highly social creatures with a profound hardwired tendency to conform to the norms of their neighbors. It is the classic pressure of keeping up with the Joneses.
Okay.
If you live in a low-scoring cognitive environment where the cultural norm is hyperconsumption, where everyone maxes out their credit cards to buy luxury cars and designer clothes, you are highly likely to adopt those impatient behaviors just to fit in.
Right, because that's what success looks like locally.
But what if the Joneses are highly prudent, forward-thinking savers?
Oh, I see.
If you live in an environment where the cultural norm is to drive a reliable 10-year-old car, quietly invest in index funds, and prioritize long-term stability.
You will absorb that behavior.
Yes. Your personal test score might be completely average, but because your cognitive environment is dominated by high patience norms, you conform to those wealth-generating behaviors.
The hive mind creates a self-reinforcing gravity of deferred gratification.
That is exactly it.
That is a staggering insight. Your financial patience, and therefore your ultimate wealth, is contagious. It is downloaded from your neighbors.
Cultural transmission.
But building physical factories and accumulating foreign bonds is only half the battle. Physical capital is totally useless if it isn't protected. This culture of patience and cooperation must also build the rules that govern the society.
We're talking about the transition from economics to political science now. We have to look at how the hive mind builds the state.
Right, because the book frames this transition beautifully as the journey from Machiavelli to Coase.
I love that framing. When we think of governmental failure, we often picture routine corruption. A health inspector demanding a bribe to approve a restaurant kitchen, or a police officer taking cash to tear up a speeding ticket.
Which is a terrible drag on an economy, sure.
It is, but routine corruption is a minor nuisance compared to the existential threat of total state confiscation.
Total confiscation.
Meaning what?
If a government operates like a Machiavellian predator, if it can arbitrarily seize your factory, freeze your bank assets, or nationalize your industry without due process, the incentive architecture of the society collapses.
Because no one will practice Ramsey's patience if the referee can just steal the trophy at any moment. Why save if the government will just take it?
Exactly.
So how does a high-scoring society neutralize that Machiavellian threat? Because history is full of powerful people trying to take what isn't theirs.
They neutralize it through the mechanisms described by the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase, specifically the Coase theorem. Okay, what is the Coase theorem?
Coase theorized about how rational actors resolve disputes without descending into what Thomas Hobbes called the war of all against all.
Let's do an example.
Imagine a scenario where a steel factory is dumping chemical runoff into a river, destroying the livelihood of the local fishermen downstream.
Classic negative externality.
Right. In a low-functioning environment, this dispute escalates into violence, or the government arbitrarily shuts down the factory, destroying jobs. Both outcomes result in massive, deadweight economic loss.
But a cohesion bargain looks completely different.
Yes. Coase proved that if property rights are clearly defined and transaction costs are low, the factory owner and the fisherman will negotiate a mathematically optimal compromise.
How does that actually work in practice?
Perhaps the factory owner realizes that installing a chemical filter costs $50,000, but the fishermen are losing $100,000 a year in fish.
Okay.
The fishermen can pool their resources, pay the factory owner $60,000 to install the filter, and they still come out $40,000 ahead.
So the factory gets a free upgrade plus $10,000 profit, the river is clean, and the economy continues to function.
It's the mall developer scenario from the Vanderbilt experiment, but scaled up to civic life.
Wow. But for a cohesion bargain to work, transaction costs have to be low. And what lowers transaction costs? A population with high working memory and fluid reasoning.
Exactly. It takes cognitive capacity to draft that complex contract between the fisherman and the factory, to monitor the pollution levels, and to trust the legal system to enforce the agreement.
In nations with higher average cognitive skills, the citizens, the bureaucrats, and the corporations are constantly executing millions of these complex cohesion bargains. They resolve disputes laterally, through contracts and compromises rather than vertically, through state violence.
And we see the ultimate proof of this in the Corruption Perceptions Index. The data shows an undeniable correlation. High-scoring populations build governments that fiercely protect property rights. They design transparent legal frameworks that allow businesses to operate without arbitrary interference.
But this brings up a massive structural question that I've always struggled with. Let's say you have a high-functioning democracy in one of these high-scoring nations. You elect a charismatic, highly intelligent politician.
Okay.
They gain control of the treasury, the military, the regulatory apparatus. They have the keys to the castle.
The absolute power.
Why don't they just steal everything? Why don't they siphon billions into offshore accounts and declare themselves president for life? We see this happen constantly in developing nations. Why do popular, powerful leaders in places like Finland or Singapore willingly step down when their term ends or they lose an election?
It's a great question. To understand why politicians in high cognitive environments respect the rules, we have to return to the repeated prisoner's dilemma and the shadow of the future, but apply it to the voter base.
The voters are playing the game too.
Democracies are ultimately feedback loops. For a government to remain stable and property rights to remain secure, the voters must hold the politicians accountable.
Right.
But holding a modern politician accountable requires evaluating incredibly dense policy information.
It's not just, do you like this guy?
No. If the average voter has low cognitive skills, they are highly susceptible to short-term populist manipulation. A politician can offer a massive unfunded tax cut or a targeted cash handout right before an election.
And the voters will reward them, unable to process the long-term inflationary collapse that will inevitably follow.
Exactly. In that environment, the optimal strategy for the politician is to pillage the treasury and buy votes.
But if the voter base have a high average cognitive baseline, the game changes entirely.
Radically. A high-scoring voter base possesses the abstract reasoning to foresee the macroeconomic consequences of policy.
So if a politician attempts to seize private industry or pass catastrophic deficit spending,
The voters recognize the structural damage and vote them out.
the politicians, who are themselves highly perceptive, realize they are playing a repeated game with a sophisticated audience.
They know they cannot rely on cheap populist tricks. They realize that the institutional stability of the nation, the system that allows them to generate legitimate wealth and influence, is far more valuable than the short-term plunder of embezzlement.
The collective intelligence of the voters acts as an impenetrable guardrail against state confiscation. The hive mind literally forces the government to behave.
It really does.
Okay, we have built a towering economic architecture here. We have seen how a high cognitive environment generates the patience to build physical capital and how it fosters the cohesion cooperation to build trustworthy, accountable governments.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But I want to return to the very beginning of our conversation. I want to return to the stranded genius.
Right. You're a software engineer, friend.
If I am a brilliant software engineer or an elite aerospace structural architect, and I live in a nation with a low average cognitive score, why am I so poor?
It's a tough reality.
If I have a high IQ, why doesn't a global corporation just hire me for $500,000 a year and let me work remotely? Why does the data show that my personal income is anchored to the low wages of my neighbors?
This is perhaps the most tragic and consequential mechanism in the entire book. To understand why the stranded genius cannot monetize their brilliance, we have to understand how modern technological production actually functions.
Okay.
The book leans heavily on a model created by Harvard economist Michael Kremer, known as the O-ring theory of economic development.
The O-ring theory. That refers to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, correct?
Yes. The Challenger explosion is the ultimate macroeconomic metaphor for modern fragility.
Because it was such a complex system.
Exactly. The space shuttle was a marvel of engineering, comprising millions of complex, highly expensive components. But on that morning, a single inexpensive rubber seal, an O-ring, failed due to cold temperatures.
And because the system was highly interdependent, the failure of that single minor component caused the main external fuel tank to rupture,
Destroying the entire multi-billion-dollar vehicle and causing tragic loss of life.
It's heartbreaking. But how does that apply to economics?
Kremer observed that the modern economy is increasingly structured exactly like the space shuttle. We operate in what are called multiplicative production functions.
I need you to translate that. What does a multiplicative production function look like in a business setting?
Let's use the analogy of producing a massive blockbuster movie.
Okay, Hollywood.
Imagine you are at a studio and you hire an elite, Oscar-winning director. That director is a perfect, flawless component. They are a 1.0 in our equation.
Terrific score.
But to make the movie, the director must rely on a cinematographer, a lead actor, a lighting crew, and a sound editor. If the sound editor is incompetent, let's say they're a 0.5, they fail to capture the dialogue clearly.
Okay, so you have a bad sound mix.
In an additive economy, the brilliance of the director would compensate for the bad sound. But a movie is multiplicative. It's director, 1.0, multiplied by sound editor, 0.5. The result is 0.5. The entire output is cut in half. No matter how brilliant the cinematography or the acting, if the audience cannot hear the dialogue, the movie is a total failure and loses hundreds of millions of dollars.
So a single weak link destroys the value of the entire chain, and this dynamic explains why talent clusters together.
Exactly. Economists call this endogenous sorting by worker skill. Because elite output is so fragile, elite workers absolutely refuse to work with mediocre workers.
The Oscar-winning director demands an Oscar-winning sound editor.
The market naturally sorts the highly skilled workers together into highly reliable, immensely profitable O-ring networks.
Okay, but let's apply this to my stranded genius. Let's say I'm an elite aerospace engineer living in a developing nation. I want to build commercial satellites.
Okay, you're the 1.0.
I am a perfect 1.0. But to build my satellite, I need to source metallurgical aluminum from a local factory. If the local cognitive environment is low, the factory manager might lack the processing power to maintain strict quality control. The aluminum has microscopic fractures. That's a point 0.5.
Yep, failure point 1.
I need to run supercomputers to simulate orbital mechanics. But the local power grid fails for 3 hours every afternoon because the municipal engineers can't optimize the load balancing. That's a point 0.5.
Failure point 2.
I need a local lawyer to patent my thruster design, but the legal system is backed up and the lawyer misses a filing deadline. That's a point 0.5.
It cascades.
My brilliant 1.0 engineering capacity is multiplied by a cascading series of 0.5 failures. The satellite never launches. My personal IQ is literally trapped by the unreliability of the collective infrastructure around me. I cannot form an elite O-ring team, so my brilliance produces zero economic value.
That is a flawless synthesis of the mechanism. Your productivity is permanently capped by the reliability of the strangers in your supply chain.
It's devastating.
And this leads to the second half of Kramer's theory. If a society lacks the collective cognitive capacity to execute these complex, highly profitable O-ring tasks, what do the workers do?
They still have to work somewhere.
Right. They must find employment in what the text calls the foolproof sector.
The foolproof sector. What defines a foolproof job?
Economists refer to this as a Cobb-Douglas production function. These are tasks that are additive rather than multiplicative. A mistake by one worker does not destroy the entire output.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about harvesting a field of crops by hand, or mowing lawns, or working as a checkout cashier at a grocery store.
Okay, manual or routine labor.
If you manage 10 cashiers, and one of them is struggling with the register and moving very slowly, it doesn't cause the grocery store to explode.
You simply open another lane or hire an 11th cashier to pick up the slack.
Exactly. In the foolproof sector, quantity can perfectly substitute for quality. 10 average workers can substitute for 8 elite workers. The production process is highly resilient to errors.
But if an entire nation is forced to rely on the foolproof sector because they can't execute O-ring tasks, that has to have a devastating impact on wages, right?
It creates a catastrophic wage floor due to a mechanism called the law of one price, combined with massive diminishing marginal returns.
Break that down for me.
If a nation cannot build software or pharmaceuticals or aerospace technology, millions of workers have no choice but to flood into the foolproof sector. The subsistence agriculture or basic retail.
And when you have millions of people competing to mow lawns or harvest crops, the sheer oversupply of labor drives the value of that labor into the ground.
A farm owner doesn't have to pay a premium for a smart worker because they can just hire 3 cheap workers to do the same job.
And because of the law of one price, the wages in the foolproof sector drag down the wages across the entire domestic economy.
Exactly. Even our stranded genius aerospace engineer, if they cannot build their satellite, eventually has to take a job managing a retail logistics chain or doing basic IT support.
Earning a fraction of what their cognitive peers in Singapore or Finland are earning?
Because they are trapped in a foolproof economy.
As I listen to this, it feels incredibly bleak. It feels like a deterministic trap.
It can definitely sound that way.
Because we are moving into an era of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, technology is becoming more fragile, more multiplicative, and more interdependent. The O-ring networks are only going to demand higher and higher levels of collective reliability.
That is true.
If a nation is currently stuck in the low-wage foolproof sector with a low average cognitive baseline, are they just permanently locked out of the modern economy? Are they doomed?
No, they are absolutely not doomed. And it is crucial that we emphasize this because the source material provides a deeply optimistic off-ramp.
Oh, good. We need an off-ramp.
The system we've described is a feedback loop. And while feedback loops can spiral downward, they can also be deliberately engineered to spiral upward.
How do we know that?
We know this is possible because we have watched it happen across the globe over the last century. This brings us to the phenomenon known as the Flynn effect.
Named after James Flynn, the philosopher who developed the dog and rabbit abstract reasoning test we talked about earlier.
Yes. When Flynn began analyzing historical intelligence data, he made a staggering discovery. Over the course of the 20th century, in industrialized nations, average IQ scores, specifically on tests of fluid reasoning like the Raven's matrices, did not stay flat.
What happened to them?
They rose continuously, massively, and undeniably, decade after decade.
Really? By how much?
We were talking about gains of 3 points per decade. An average person taking a test in 1990 scored vastly higher on fluid reasoning than an average person taking the exact same test in 1920.
But human genetics don't evolve that quickly. We didn't biologically mutate into a new, smarter species in 70 years.
Yeah.
So what drove the Flynn effect?
The Flynn effect proves conclusively that national cognitive capacity is a construct of the physical environment. The massive gains in the 20th century were driven by systemic public health interventions.
Like what kinds of interventions?
It was the widespread implementation of childhood vaccinations and sanitation systems, which meant children's bodies no longer had to divert massive amounts of metabolic energy to fight off endemic parasites and diseases.
That energy was redirected to building the physical architecture of the brain.
Exactly. It was the iodine fortification of salt, which eradicated a major cause of preventable cognitive stunting.
Wow. Just salt.
And perhaps most profoundly, it was the removal of environmental toxins, particularly the global push for lead abatement.
Taking lead out of paint and gas.
Banning leaded gasoline literally removed a neurotoxin from the atmosphere, allowing an entire generation's collective intelligence to physically expand.
That is the ultimate systemic lever. You change the regulations on gasoline, and 30 years later, your nation has the cognitive capacity to build microchips and negotiate cohesion treaties.
It is incredible.
But it presents a chicken and egg problem. If a country is currently trapped in the foolproof sector, mired in poverty and corruption, who organizes the capital to build the sanitation systems? Who fights the entrenched interest to ban the leaded gasoline? How does a nation trigger the start of the Flynn effect?
This is where we look at the specific role of the cognitive elite.
The elite.
The researcher Heiner Rinderman analyzed this dynamic and found that while the average cognitive score dictates the broad reliability of the society, the specific cognitive skills of the top 5% of a population play a disproportionate role in jumpstarting the system.
So the top 5% are the catalyst.
It is often that top 5%, the leading epidemiologists, the innovative policymakers, the elite civil engineers, and the tenacious entrepreneurs who force the technological frontier open.
They're the ones who advocate for the initial public health investments.
And who fight against the Machiavellian corruption to establish the first beachheads of secure property rights.
They act as the ignition spark for the engine. I want to pause here and ask you, the listener, to reflect on your own daily life through this lens. Consider the sheer volume of invisible competence you rely on to survive.
It really is invisible until it fails.
Exactly. When you get on a train, you are trusting the abstract reasoning of the civil engineer who calculated the load-bearing stress of the bridge. When you buy food, you are trusting the supply chain manager who maintained the cold storage network.
When you listen to this audio, you are relying on thousands of strangers maintaining server farms and fiber optic routing protocols.
Your personal success, your safety, and your wealth are almost entirely predicated on the cognitive reliability of people you will never meet.
And realizing that interconnectedness allows us to see the ultimate systemic trajectory, the Flynn cycle.
The Flynn cycle, how does that loop close?
It is an upward spiral of prosperity. It begins when that cognitive elite, or a dedicated government, makes a seemingly small intervention, let's say improving municipal water sanitation.
Okay, cleaner water.
That intervention slightly lowers pathogen stress in children. 20 years later, those children enter the workforce with a slightly higher baseline of fluid reasoning.
Which means better O-ring networks.
Exactly. That higher cognitive capacity allows the society to take on slightly more complex O-ring manufacturing tasks and allows them to negotiate slightly better cohesion bargains, reducing civic friction.
That newly generated economic wealth is then taxed and reinvested.
The society builds better hospitals, funds more rigorous educational systems, and implements stricter environmental protections, which in turn raises the cognitive baseline of the next generation even higher. The hive mind continually reconstructs and expands itself.
It is a compounding interest loop of human capital. And that brings us back to the primary mission of this deep dive and the resolution of the crisis in perception we introduced at the top of the hour.
It really redefines everything.
We are culturally conditioned to view intelligence through the narrow, ego-driven lens of individual merit. We treat it as a personal attribute, a weapon to be used in salary negotiations, or a badge of honor to prove we are smarter than the person sitting across from us.
We view it as the ultimate tool for pie slicing.
But when we analyze this system at scale, that perception is revealed to be incredibly shallow. Intelligence, when aggregated across a population, is not a private asset. It is shared coordination infrastructure.
It's the roads and bridges of the mind.
True national prosperity does not emerge simply because a country has massive oil reserves, or because they drafted a perfect constitution, or because they elected a charismatic leader.
Prosperity emerges from the shared mental environment. It is the capacity of millions of citizens to hold abstract variables in their minds, to foresee the shadow of the future, to delay gratification, and to trust one another in complex, fragile networks.
It is the invisible web of competence that catches us all, which leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought to ponder.
I'm ready.
We have spent an hour dissecting how building up our collective cognitive capacity constructs national wealth and institutional stability. But we must also consider the forces that tear that infrastructure down.
The modern threats.
Exactly. If a society's collective cognitive capacity, its ability to deploy fluid reasoning, maintain deep working memory, and focus on long-term consequences, is quite literally its most valuable economic and political infrastructure, how should we view the modern digital landscape?
Oh, that is a dark question.
Should we start viewing hyper-addictive social media algorithms, infinite scrolling dopamine loops, and the constant barrage of digital information overload in a new light?
Not just as distractions.
Perhaps they are not just personal annoyances or individual time wasters. If they systematically degrade our attention spans and fracture our working memory, we must begin treating them as forms of systemic environmental pollution.
Wow, yes.
Just as lead in the water stunted the physical brains of the 20th century, attention-destroying algorithms may be the invisible neurotoxin actively degrading our shared hive mind today.
That is the exact analytical pivot this data demands. If our collective minds are our most vital infrastructure, we have a societal imperative to fiercely protect the environment in which they operate.
We cannot afford to look only at the individual. We must look at the entire structural framework. Crisis and Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
It's been a real pleasure.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.